They fell from the sky like ghosts, no warning, no formation, no mercy in the way they arrived. The night over Normandy had been calm, almost deceivingly peaceful, the kind of stillness that made even seasoned soldiers believe just for a moment that nothing would happen. German sentries stood smoking cigarettes near hedgerows. Officers reviewed routine reports, and field commanders assumed the enemy would come at dawn in predictable lines, with thunderous artillery to announce their presence. That was how wars were supposed to begin. That was how they had been trained to expect it. Instead, the sky itself betrayed them. At first, it was the silence that unsettled them. No engines, no bombing runs, no distant rumble of tanks. Just an unnatural quiet that pressed against the ears. Then the wind changed, carrying a sound that didn't belong to the countryside. A faint tearing noise, like cloth ripping slowly in the dark. One officer later wrote that he looked up instinctively, unsure why, and saw shapes drifting across the stars. They moved unnaturally, descending rather than flying, growing larger by the second. Before his mind could understand what his eyes were seeing, gunfire erupted somewhere behind him. The night exploded into chaos. Tracer rounds cut red scars through the darkness as German soldiers fired, blindly upward, shouting warnings that were swallowed by confusion. Parachutes blossomed open like pale flowers, dozens of them, then hundreds, filling the sky with silent invaders. Some drifted into trees, others slammed into fields or rooftops, and some landed directly in the middle of German positions. Officers screamed for order, but order had already been ripped apart. The enemy was not coming from the front. They were landing inside the lines, behind command posts, near supply routes, in places marked on maps as secure. Diaries would later describe the terror of that realization. One lieutenant wrote that it felt as if the ground itself had turned hostile, as if the battlefield no longer had edges. Another officer admitted that for the first time in the war, he did not know where the front line was because there was none. The Americans were scattered, yes, but that only made them more frightening. Each landing group was a question mark, an unknown threat lurking in the hedges, barns, and forests. Every shadow could be an enemy. Every sound a prelude to sudden death. As the first paratroopers hit the ground, they moved with terrifying speed. Training took over where plans had failed. Men cut themselves free from tangled parachutes, grabbed weapons and ammunition, and disappeared into the darkness within seconds. German patrols sent to investigate were ambushed by soldiers they never saw until muzzle flashes lit their faces. An officer described how his men were fired upon from 3 directions at once, even though intelligence insisted only a small enemy force had landed nearby. The Americans seemed to multiply, striking here, then vanishing, only to appear again somewhere else entirely. Communication collapsed almost immediately. Field telephones went dead as wires were cut, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by paratroopers landing directly on them. Messengers sent on motorcycles never returned. Officers tried to regroup their units, but each attempt only led them deeper into uncertainty. One diary entry spoke of marching for hours toward a reported enemy position, only to be attacked from behind by men who had supposedly been miles away. The night twisted distance and direction until nothing made sense. What frightened the German officers most was not the firepower, it was the behavior of the men they faced. These Americans did not wait for dawn. They did not pause to reorganize. They fought immediately, aggressively, with a confidence that suggested they had expected to be alone and surrounded. Small groups attacked machine gun nests, blew bridges, and overran checkpoints with a ferocity that felt personal. One captain wrote that he saw 3 paratroopers charge a fortified position without hesitation, 2 falling instantly, while the third kept firing until he was killed. The act made no tactical sense, yet it shattered the defender's nerve. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed the Americans were elite criminals released from prison. Others insisted they were fanatics trained only to kill. Officers tried to dismiss the stories, but even they felt doubt creeping in. Why else would men jump into darkness, scattered across enemy territory with no guarantee of survival? Why would soldiers fight so fiercely when isolated, wounded, and vastly outnumbered? The only explanation that seemed to fit was fanaticism or something worse, absolute belief in their mission. The countryside itself became an accomplice to fear. The hedgerows hid movement. The barns echoed with phantom footsteps. Every rustle of leaves made nerves tighten. German officers recorded firing at shallows, at sounds, at nothing at all. Sleep became impossible. One major admitted in his diary that he began to dread the silence more than the fighting, because silence meant the Americans were moving again, repositioning, planning their next strike. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion took its toll. Men stumbled through fields, unsure whether they were advancing or retreating. Orders contradicted each other, assuming control that no longer existed. An officer described standing at a crossroads, unable to decide which direction to send his men, because reports claimed the enemy was coming from all sides at once. In truth, they were just not in the way any textbook had prepared him for. By the time dawn approached, the psychological damage was already done. German officers wrote that the invasion had begun not with overwhelming force, but with fear planted deep in the mind. The Americans had turned the night into a weapon, using confusion as effectively as bullets. Even before the main Allied forces landed on the beaches, something vital had been lost behind the lines: certainty. And in war, certainty is often the first casualty and the most dangerous one to lose. By dawn, confusion ruled with a weight heavier than any artillery barrage. The first light did not bring clarity, it exposed the damage. Smoke drifted lazily over fields that had become killing grounds during the night. Bodies lay tangled in parachutes, some American, some German, frozen in positions that told unfinished stories. German officers emerged from improvised command posts, expecting to finally see the enemy clearly, only to realize the nightmare had merely changed shape. The Americans were still there, but now they were invisible in plain sight. Reports flooded in, each more alarming than the last. Bridges had been destroyed by small groups acting without orders anyone could trace. Ammunition depots were burning. Convoys sent to reinforce the coast never arrived. Officers tried to piece together a coherent picture, spreading maps across tables, marking enemy sightings with shaky pencils. But the markings contradicted one another. According to the reports, American paratroopers were everywhere, north, south, east, west, often appearing hours apart in locations that should have been impossible to reach so quickly. One battalion commander wrote that it felt as though the enemy moved through the land differently, not bound by roads or logic. Paratroopers appeared from forests thought to be empty, from villages already cleared, from behind units that had just marched past those same areas. Patrols sent to eliminate them returned diminished, shaken, or not at all. Survivors spoke of sudden gunfire at close range, of grenades tossed from hedgerows, of men shouting commands in accented German to confuse defenders before opening fire. The Americans fought in fragments, but those fragments behaved like a living organism. If one group was pinned down, another would strike elsewhere, forcing German units to split and resplit until they were too thin to resist anything effectively. Officers accustomed to controlling large formations now found themselves chasing shadows, with squads barely large enough to defend themselves. Orders lost meaning when there was no clear enemy front to push back against. Diaries from that morning revealed something deeper than tactical frustration, a creeping loss of confidence. One officer admitted that for the first time, he questioned whether experience mattered at all against such an enemy. He had fought in Poland, France, Russia. He had faced tanks, massed infantry, endless artillery, but never had he faced soldiers who seemed comfortable operating without structure, without reinforcement, without even certainty of survival. These Americans fought as if isolation empowered them rather than weakened them. Encounters grew more disturbing as the day wore on. A German company attempting to regroup near a farmstead was ambushed by what they believed was a platoon. After a brutal firefight, they discovered only 4 American paratroopers had been involved, 2 of them wounded. Another officer described capturing a lone American who had been fighting for hours with no food, no water, and limited ammunition. When asked where his unit was, the paratrooper reportedly laughed and said, "You're standing in it." The remark spread quickly, retold with a mix of disbelief and dread. Psychological strain began to erode discipline. Soldiers fired too early, revealing positions to enemies they never actually saw. Others hesitated too long, convinced every movement was a trap. German officers noted how their men began to whisper about the Americans rather than speak openly, as if naming them too loudly might summon another ambush. The paratroopers had become less an opposing force and more a presence, something felt rather than seen. By midday, exhaustion blurred judgment. Officers who had not slept for more than an hour at a time struggled to make decisions. Each new report forced impossible choices: protect supply lines or pursue saboteurs, defend villages or reinforce the coast, hunt paratroopers or prepare for the expected beach landings. The Americans exploited this paralysis relentlessly. While German units argued and repositioned, small enemy teams continued their work, destroying radios, blocking roads, spreading chaos far beyond their actual numbers. Several diaries mention a particular terror: the Americans' refusal to disengage. Traditional tactics assumed an isolated force would withdraw when faced with superior numbers. These men did not. They attacked supply trucks head-on. They assaulted fortified positions with little regard for casualties. They kept fighting when wounded, sometimes propping themselves against walls or trees to continue firing. Officers struggled to reconcile this behavior with any doctrine they knew. It was as if fear simply did not affect these soldiers the way it affected everyone else. As afternoon approached, the first confirmed news of massive landings on the beaches reached inland units. Instead of relief, the information brought dread. Officers realized the paratroopers had succeeded in their true mission: delay, disrupt, and terrify. Roads meant for reinforcements were unusable. Units meant to counterattack. The beaches were scattered, exhausted, or pinned down by enemies they couldn't locate. The Americans behind the lines had turned hours into eternity. One senior officer wrote that the most damaging weapon the paratroopers carried was not their rifles or explosives, but uncertainty. Every decision felt wrong. Every pause felt fatal. Even when no shots were fired, the sense of being watched never faded. Men jumped at birds taking flight. Vehicles stopped abruptly when drivers imagined obstacles that weren't there. The countryside had become hostile, not because of terrain, but because of fear layered into every field and road. By evening, German command attempted to restore control, issuing firm orders and threatening punishment for disorganization. But authorities sounded hollow in a world where a handful of enemy soldiers could derail entire regiments. Officers obeyed, but doubt lingered. They had seen what the Americans could do with almost nothing. The question that haunted them was what would happen when those same soldiers were finally reinforced. As darkness fell again, the diaries grew shorter, the handwriting shakier. Some entries ended mid-sentence, never completed. Others simply noted locations and times, as if the writers feared there would be no chance to explain later. The Americans were still out there, moving, listening, waiting. And deep down, the officers understood a truth they dared not say aloud. Battle for control had already been lost long before the main armies met. The paratroopers had broken something invisible but vital, the belief that the situation could still be mastered. Days passed, but time itself seemed to fracture for those trapped behind the line. What should have been measured in hours blurred into a continuous strain of fear, fatigue, and quiet resignation. German officers continued to write, though many no longer knew why. Some wrote out of habit, others out of desperation, as if fixing words to paper might restore order to a world that had slipped beyond control. The tone of the diaries changed. The sharp confidence of earlier entries faded, replaced by something heavier, acceptance mixed with disbelief. By the third day, it was no longer possible to pretend the American paratroopers were merely an inconvenience. Their presence had reshaped the battlefield. German units that should have been concentrated and powerful were instead scattered, reacting rather than commanding. Every attempt to form a coherent counterattack collapsed under the same weight: delays, ambushes, destroyed roads, missing officers. The Americans had not defeated them outright. They had hollowed them out from within. One colonel wrote that he finally understood the purpose of the airborne assault. It was not simply to seize bridges or disrupt communications. It was to invade the mind. His men no longer trusted the ground beneath their feet or the silence around them. Orders were followed mechanically, without belief. Even when superior numbers were assembled, hesitation lingered, unspoken fear that somewhere nearby, unseen eyes were already measuring the next weakness. Captured paratroopers added to the unease. Interrogations yielded little of value, but what disturbed officers most was the demeanor of the prisoners. They were calm, sometimes even amused. Many appeared younger than expected, yet spoke with certainty about their mission. When told they were surrounded, they shrugged. When informed that their drop had been scattered, they smiled. One officer recorded that a captured American simply said that was the plan. Whether true or not, the statement spread like poison. As Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, the true cost of the airborne chaos became undeniable. German units arrived late, if at all. Tanks were delayed by demolished bridges. Infantry columns took wrong turns, redirected by false reports planted intentionally or accidentally by paratroopers. Every hour lost behind the lines strengthened the Allied advance ahead. Officers could see the larger picture forming, and it terrified them more than any firefight. The diaries grew more personal. Some officers wrote about their men, how they flinched at sudden sounds, how they stared too long into hedgerows, how jokes had disappeared entirely from conversation. Veterans of the Eastern Front admitted they had never seen morale collapse this way. There, the enemy had been overwhelming, relentless. Here, the enemy was elusive, surgical, psychologically relentless. The Americans did not crush resistance, they unraveled it. One major described a moment that haunted him. His unit finally cornered a small group of paratroopers in a village at dusk. After a brief fight, the Americans were killed. Victory should have followed. Instead, silence fell thick and oppressive. No cheers, no relief. The men waited, convinced another attack was coming. When nothing happened, the realization struck harder than any bullet. Even in victory, fear remained. The enemy no longer needed to be present to exert power. As supply shortages worsened, hunger and exhaustion deepened the sense of inevitability. Officers wrote of rationing ammunition not because it was scarce, but because confidence in using it effectively had faded. Why fire at a distant sound when the true threat might come from behind? Why advance when standing still felt just as dangerous? Decision-making slowed to a crawl. Each choice weighed against imagined consequences. Some diaries reveal moments of grim admiration. An officer noted that the Americans had mastered a form of warfare that did not rely on numbers or territory, but on initiative. Cut off from command, they became their own commanders. Isolated, they became aggressive. Lost, they created purpose from chaos. These observations were never meant for official reports. They were confessions, private acknowledgments of an enemy that had changed the rules. By the time organized resistance began to collapse, many officers sensed the end before it arrived. Retreats were framed as tactical repositioning, but few believed it. The airborne landings had accelerated something already underway. The myth of control, carefully maintained through years of victories and propaganda, had cracked. Once broken, it could not be repaired under fire. The final diary entries are the most revealing. They are quieter, stripped of analysis and speculation. Some simply list events without emotion. Others express regret not just for defeat, but for underestimating what courage and adaptability could achieve. One officer wrote that history would remember the invasion for its scale, its ships, its armies, but he knew the truth was smaller and more unsettling. It began with men who fell alone into darkness and refused to surrender to it. When the fighting moved on, and the paratroopers finally linked up with advancing Allied forces, their work was already done. They had delayed reinforcements, shattered coordination, and planted fear deep enough to outlast their presence. The Germans would continue to fight, but something fundamental had shifted. Confidence, once lost, did not return easily. Long after the war, those diaries would remain pages filled with crossed-out sentences, hurried scribbles, and moments of clarity written under unbearable pressure. They did not speak of grand strategy or glorious battles. They spoke of confusion, of uncertainty, of an enemy that arrived without warning and refused to behave as expected. In those pages, fear was not weakness, it was recognition. The American paratroopers did not win the war alone. They did something more subtle and perhaps more powerful. They taught their enemy that the future of warfare belonged not only to armies, but to individuals, willing to act without certainty, without backup, without fear of being alone. And that lesson, written in ink and remembered in silence, endured long after the guns fell quiet.